Welcome to The Carpenter's Daughter,
the show where we dig into politics, policy, culture, faith, and pretty much everything in between.
Every week we sit down together for real conversations about the issues shaping our world.
I'm Iffy Ike, lawyer, author, and perpetual question asker.
I'm Alexis, Confer, artist, political organizer, and lover of a good deep dive.
We bring our experiences, our curiosity, and our commitment to community
to unpack what's happening, why it matters, and how it impacts all of us. This is the Carpenter's Daughter. Let's get into it. Well, today is so exciting. On today's episode, we're joined by my very good friend, Amit Bagga, and we're just so excited to dig in with Amit. I've known Amit really since our Queens County Young Dems days, but really when Queens was starting to transform, and we love it, and we love to see the progressive boom that Queens has been having. And so Amit is the principal of Public Progress, a campaign strategy and public affairs firm with one client, New Yorkers. Love that, Amit.
I love it.
Bagga founded the firm in 2024 after nearly 2 decades in federal, city, and state government. Public Progress's clients and partners include Yes on Affordable Housing, Democracy Alliance, Battleground New York Immigration Coalition, Working Families Party, as well as labor and community groups. A frequent guest on local and national media, Bagga has advised dozens of campaigns, including, some you may have heard of, including those of Brad Lander and Zohran Mamdani.
Never heard of him.
And is a member of The Choice, the New York Times panel of experts advising on the mayoral race. While in government, Bagga served as Deputy Secretary of Intergovernmental Affairs to Governor Kathy Hochul, crafted New York City's $40 million Census campaign, which I got to see firsthand what he built there was incredible, and worked extensively on issues of labor, social services, and immigration. Bagga is a native of the Bronx and a longtime resident of Queens. Amit, we're so happy to have you here.
I'm so thrilled to be
so
here.
Excited. Oh my goodness.
You're really of the moment, Amit. I saw you, I think Amit really it embodies what we're trying to do here.
Absolutely.
From his creative background, his political and organizing background, so much movement work, which I know is deeply personal for you. And we're just so excited to dig into that today. But you're a Renaissance person. And I love that.
I try to be. Bringing the 1500s into the 2020s.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, others are trying to do that as well in different ways. Yeah.
In the wrong way.
Yeah, I'm not ready to wear an apron yet or, a petticoat.
It's so important for us to start the conversation with all the amazing, things of what you have done, but we also know that that's not all of who you are, right? So we like to start with this segment called How's Your Light? And want to just get a sense as to what motivates you to do what you do. And outside of what you do, how would your people describe Amit? What would they say?
That's a good one.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be, I think, your first guest. Is that right?
Yeah,
that is right.
The first one.
So this is fantastic. And thank you for your kind words. I think about this question a lot. I just turned 40 just a couple of weeks ago.
Welcome.
Thank you.
He threw a fabulous birthday party with a full speaking program in Glitterati of New York. So, and it was good. It was really good.
And I've actually been contemplating a little bit on this question about what gets me out of bed, right? And after you spend nearly 2 decades in public service inside government, which comes with its many opportunities and its many challenges, and then you choose to pivot, how you commit yourself to public service. Because to me, running these campaigns, advising, whether it's candidates or organizations on important issues, it is really a continuation of that service. But it takes a different form. And so I've contemplated a lot this question of what is it that inspires me? And I actually come back mostly to really where it all began, which is with my parents. My parents they're in their 80s now. They've lived in New York City for 50 plus years. My father is Sikh, my mother is Hindu. They were both born in what is today Pakistan. And in 1947, when they were kids, they found themselves on quote unquote the wrong side of the border overnight. And they fled in the dark cover of night, both families, from what is now the Pakistani part of Punjab, and came to India as refugees as children. And it was a really harrowing, difficult tale, to think about. When people think about what life is like as a refugee, people have seen this on their screens a lot in the last 10, 15 years, right? We've seen huge movements of refugees into Europe, obviously into the United States in more recent years. Now picture that in 1947, right?
Right.
When there is really no technology, there are no basic services like running water. And when I think about the lives that they've led, which is having to flee Pakistan, coming to Bombay, families have nothing but the clothes on their backs, and then rebuilding their lives from scratch.
Yeah.
And each family, one having 9 kids, one having 7, educating them, all of the siblings and all of the kids going to university, which was a huge feat in the 1960s for anyone, let alone kids from refugee families. And that includes women, by the way, all of the women in the families, or nearly all of them, I should say. And then making the decision as adults, actually, not even really as young people, but people who are already in their 30s, to move to the United States, right? And to try to build a better life for themselves. And this is at a time when there were no South Asians in the United States. There were very few. I was recently on New York One with Errol Lewis, and we were talking a little bit about this moment. It was actually election night. And we were talking about what it means for the South Asian community generally that we have a South Asian mayor. And when you look back at the census, we can talk a little bit more about the census.
Love it.
In 1970, you had fewer than 10,000 South Asians. So this is people from the entire Indian subcontinent, which includes Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, right? Fewer than 10,000 people. Today, that number is estimated to be over 500,000. Right?
Wow.
And so the New York City that my parents emigrated to was a very different place. There was no one here that looks like them, that sounded like them. We had the benefit, in many ways, people would argue the benefit of being English speakers. Obviously South Asia being a series of countries that are former British colonies, which I think gave South Asians a leg up in a way compared to many other immigrants. But that experience of having to fight for your life, to fight for your dignity, to figure out how to build a better life for yourself and then ultimately for your family. My mom tells a story. I mean, maybe this will sound trite to many people who've heard immigrant stories before, but as a young woman, she sort of rejected the rigidity of marriage, which was a very, very, very rebellious act.
It was incredibly progressive for the time frame.
And she went to graduate school and got a master's. And by the time she came to New York City, she had a master's degree in social work, and no one would hire her. And so she cleaned houses to make a living. When my father came a couple of years later, they were not married at the time. He came with very little money in his pocket. And back then, before the current ravages of climate change, the winters were extremely cold, even colder than what the last few weeks have been. Yeah. And he tells a story of how he worked in an open air parking lot at Wagner College on Staten Island, which is where he had gotten a scholarship, in nothing but a very light sweater because he couldn't afford a winter coat. And a professor of his took pity on him and took him to Burlington Coat Factory and bought him a used coat. I mean, this is the story, right? Yeah. And so when I think about what it means for an individual to have to dig so deeply inside themselves to find a well of resilience, to find a well of optimism, to find a work ethic that can empower someone who's been through that set of experiences to continue to build a better life for themselves. I think about a couple of things. One, the promise in theory that America and the United States is supposed to offer all of us, right? And has in fact offered hundreds of millions of immigrants over the years, and New York City in particular. But I also think about what it means to tap into that well of energy and resilience and share it with the world. Because while they tell me those stories about themselves individually, I know that there was a community of people around them who was also supporting them. And whatever those struggles were, whatever they went through, made my life possible. And so all I can ever think about is how do I make that life possible, maybe in a more macro way, for the New Yorkers around me.
Thank you so much for sharing, Amit. There's so many parallels and similarities with my parents' journey. I don't know if people really understand the community of especially like invisibilized domestic work.
Yes.
That a lot of, especially femme folk, when they come here, they are subjected to. And oftentimes are isolated in their treatment and how, you know, they go through maneuvering, getting to that promise that you're speaking of. And in a lot of ways, it's the hope of that promise, if anything, for their children, that drives them, which always kind of like F's with me a little bit, because I also think about what parts of their own promise they, even if it's temporarily, and sometimes not temporarily, but how much they not only sacrifice, but actually like daily dying to self, right? Like this concept of if I die to certain pleasures and if I die to certain even like pushback or, you know, people not treating me well. And we don't think about labor in the fullness of it. Oftentimes we think about it in the limited economic sense, which is why it frustrates me when we talk about immigrant communities, first-gen communities, and automatically the conversation goes to labor and like what we gain and money versus like well-being and quality of life and sacrifice, and usually living under a poverty level that doesn't even get discussed. So there's so many things about that, but just thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a story of a lot of people.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's what that is part of what makes New York.
Yeah.
And that is incredible just to know that you could be doing anything else, but you're doing the macro work is also a testament to the strength of a community that I don't know if a lot of people know how strong that community is, which is also part of why Alexis and I were like, this is amazing that you're here, because I don't know if people, I don't know, and you can probably let me know, but I don't know if the space is given, afforded, shared, to hear even the differences of South Asian communities. It's a large space of various ethnicities. Oftentimes it's lumped. So we'll get into that in a second.
Yeah. And honestly, you know, I had never heard some of those pieces of your story. And one reason I wanted you on here is because we're talking a lot about the different ways you can kind of reclaim like how we're actually framing people in the world, because there's so many people, yes, who are causing harm right now, but there's a lot of people who are doing incredibly good work. And, you know, I've had the honor of meeting your parents a handful of times, such wonderful people. And, you know, this next segment, we're talking about salt of the earth, and that kind of ties to kind of the church growing up we had of talking about like the salt of the earth, but you hear it in more, you know, regular commonplace language of like that salt of the earth family. And I think for so many times it's been kind of designated to one group in the US. But when I think about the immigrant experience, I think about how much of the things that we all not only enjoy, but like have made us thrive as a society has been because of immigrants, like both your parents. And like, I just find it to be really exciting to highlight them, but you are also salt of the earth in my mind. And so when I was thinking about the friends I would want on the show, I think it's been so indicative that the way you move through the world, you know, all joking aside about your birthday the other night, I mean, there were friends from all different walks of life that you've clearly impacted through work, through your social life, but like people have been so loyal to you for so many years. I mean, I think we're going on well over a decade.
Yes.
And so, you know, I want to dig a little bit deeper into some of the multifaceted elements of Amit. Like just as cultures are multifaceted, so are people, and we don't like create a lot of grace for that. So going back to your incredible political work in this moment and organizing work, Iffy and I talk a lot about things can't just be lumped into politics, because really a lot of this is grassroots organizing, community building, right relationship. There's a reason why people show up to a party, because they feel an actual right relationship and real relationship with you. And so you've described this moment as a maturation of decades of work by progressive South Asians. And I'm assuming you're referring to this moment with our new mayor, often led by queer people. When you look back at that lineage, what feels most important for people to understand about the groundwork that made this moment possible? So really whatever that means to you, Amit, but would just love to hear like kind of your take on this moment. I really did not know the stats about even like the growth of the South Asian population in New York City. That's a tremendous growth just in your parents' lifetime.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I do think of this moment with the election of Zoran Mamdani as, like you said, a maturation of many, many decades of work. This is work that's been done by immigrant communities broadly. It's very frequently been led by queer people who I think many of us choose to be in this work because it is actually about our own survival.
Right.
So how do you survive every day? Well, and if the only way you can do that is to get up and fight, then you have to, right? You don't really have an option. And so I'll provide a little bit of context, and I'll drill down into sort of some of the work that I've done and also predecessors before me. I think for South Asians in particular, and I think this is true for people from many former British colonies, the British attempted in some way, shape, or form to leave behind some idea of democracy, or new incoming administrations, people who were in positions of power all over Africa, the Caribbean, South Asia, decided that this was the type of governmental system that we were going to embrace. And I think in South Asia, it was, and in India in particular, it was crafted as a great experiment in some ways that are similar to the ways in which it was done in the United States, right? In the US, you had this ragtag, otherwise fractious group of 13 colonies, at least this is what we're told, that sort of came together to fight for their independence and this, that, and the other thing. They each had their own identities. We also know that while obviously the English were, one of the largest contributing ethno-nationalist groups in terms of, the white population of the colonizing population at the time, there were also many others. You had French, you had German. And in a way, there's something similar that's going on in South Asia, where the nation state of India is really a rather an ambitious concept and project. You're pulling together, Iffy, as you mentioned, people of literally hundreds of different ethnicities who speak thousands of languages and dialects put together. The northern Indian languages and dialects are completely a different language group than the southern ones. While there are, of course, many loanwords in both, functionally, they might as well be as different as Chinese and Greek. They're totally mutually unintelligible, right? And so to try to unify a nation like this that also has experienced this massive break, this fissure in the form of partition, right, is creating a whole new identity. And that identity, in theory, was supposed to be created through if you read the preamble of the Indian Constitutional, a secular, socialist, pluralistic democracy. And I think particularly for many of the earlier South Asians who emigrated to the United States, whether the extent to which anyone individually bought into this notion is a question mark, right? Obviously, but it was the air that people were breathing, right? I mean, this new nation, right? And for those coming to the United States, I mean, at least to hear my parents talk about it, they say the way in which democracy was sort of unfolding in India felt like it was riven by corruption and riven by special interests. And the US actually represented sort of, in theory, we all know we are an incredibly flawed democracy,
right?
The beacon as an example.
At that time,
And I think for a lot of South Asians, despite the incredible amounts of discrimination, we have experienced alongside our siblings from all parts of the world in the US, there was something special and unique about the idea that there should be a space for us here. And while South Asians in particular, I think, are often subject to this concept of the quote unquote model minority, right? A bunch of engineers and doctors and people who have multiple graduate degrees and go off and keep their heads down and, do their thing. It is also true that the very same education that has equipped many South Asians to be competitive in the economic sphere is the very same education that also has imparted a lot of the ideals of democracy. And so when you look back at the birth of sort of what it meant to be a progressive South Asian in the United States, it actually starts with South Asian immigrants who were largely queer. It starts with magazines like Trikone, which started in San Francisco in the 80s. It started with organizations like SALGA, which is the South Asian Lesbian and Gay Association here in New York, which has been around for 30 years. And it started with academics. And these are folks who really lived on the margins at the time. I mean, it's one thing to have this conversation in 2025. It was another thing altogether to try to have it in 1985 or 1995. And the way in which people organized were people would print publications in secret and they would mail them out to people who subscribed via mail in white, unmarked, larger envelopes, right? Because no one could know what the contents of the envelope were, right? And when you think about how folks were writing, how they were communicating with each other, they were figuring out ways to build power within a system where all of the decks were already stacked against them, but they felt like there was an opening. And so when I think about this moment, I think about Trikone. I think about Salga. I think about so many of the queer South Asian leaders that have organized with each other and organized in the spaces in which they work and organized in their own communities and fought incredible amounts of discrimination and ostracization to essentially proclaim an identity. And in a way, it's actually a lot of those folks that put the community on the map and created the space for your doctors and your engineers to have a place in society because someone was actually fighting for them. And when you look back, there's so much art that's associated with that. There's culture that's associated with that. South Asians are generally a joyful people. We like to be social. We engage with each other. And so decades of that work to me have led to this moment. And broadening the aperture just a little bit, organizations like Make the Road, organizations like the New York Immigration Coalition, even organizations that we consider to be more part of the mainstream, like the Hispanic Federation, right? Every one of these has been a building block in a way that has built, from my perspective, the firmament in New York City in which we live today. And yes, the ability for a mayoral candidate to recruit 100,000 volunteers to knock doors, that itself might be history making. But the ideas, the strategies, the tactics, the type of thinking that has gone in to create that is something that's been invested in a long time. And so for many, they will see this moment as maybe an overnight change.
Right.
And I see it as a maturation.
Yeah, I love that because I think that good organizing often looks easy. But you kind of feel like, yeah, how did this happen? How did this person pop up as a national leader? But I feel like, my own experience in New York, it's been beautiful to see the coalition building, even in our time, working in government together, or the work you do on the census, like just the changing face of how politics is done, how the city is led, what people have different bully pulpits, if you will. Like it's changed so rapidly in recent years and even since COVID. And I think that this moment in time now too also is a direct response to what we're kind of seeing nationally. It just feels all the richer to see the good work of community organizers and people who are doing the grassroots work of long-term relationship building, long-term structural change. And you've definitely been someone in my journey on that I've seen do incredible work.
Yeah, no, I think when you were talking about, I love the concept of maturation because it's like any word with an ing, right? It's like it's still maturing, right? Like it's evolving and it's allowed to build upon each other. I think that's a really helpful, graceful way to connect with organizers, especially for me as somebody who identifies as Black and a whole range of identities. Oftentimes our communities are seen, even by other communities, non-white communities, as you have to have all the answers and you need to do everything right all the time, versus like really looking back at the ways that our blueprints have often started from concept of safety and connection and even simplicity, like the concept of being discreet with how you share information. It reminds me of the history of the Black Panthers and using cartoons and art and zines as a way to convey various principles. And I also think that there's a lot of cross movement, history, even between South Asian communities and Black communities. Absolutely. That often gets missed, to your point. That's like not a surprise to a lot of Black and brown organizers, but in a larger scale, it's just not as discussed. And so a lot of things that you're raising, I'm like, oh, that sounds really familiar.
Yes,
like
yes.
that is actually how spaces like institutions, spaces that even now in a world of, anti-intellectualism, if you will, we don't talk enough about how those spaces, albeit we were not the ones that created it, so they do have their own motives of even exclusion, even within our own communities. But I love what you said about, but we saw an opening, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's not a perfect system. And also there was an opportunity there, right? And so what does it mean to kind of just pick up the sticks that you got and we're going to still do something with it is the thing we can't let get destroyed. It's what makes us us. Right. And so I really appreciate the way that you're challenging, even in this conversation, almost like let's get rid of the let's get rid of the pristine nature that we talk about movement, and let's really talk about how people just did things out of necessity. And now it's like, I'm thinking about what's next. And so I asked this question, even adding the layer of the many intersections that you represent, of what it also means to be, you started talking about this mix, even within the South Asian community, which included the queer community. And you talk about showing up as both South Asian, and let me also just say brown, because sometimes people don't know who you are when they see us. And so I say that as a political term, like I represent as Black. People don't know what that means. And sometimes that's a gift and sometimes that's problematic. So as a brown queer person, it feels like you stand in the power of it being political, like as a political act. And in this moment when so much of that is being attacked, right? Mm-hmm. And so much of that is even attempted to be erased. Can you unpack a little bit why, like how your just being is part of the pushback? I love your work, but just like showing up, waking up, smiling, being social, right? Can you just talk a little bit about like
dressing incredibly, being fabulous
seriously,
all the time?
Like,
I mean, seriously.
We don't talk about like
Amit always brings
how, I just want to hear from you a little bit about maybe different definitions of what a political act is versus just activism and doing.
Yes. Well, I think each of us actually is political in a way, whether or not we understand ourselves to be, because we represent who we are as individuals, but whether or not it should be this way, I think we've all been socialized to perceive individuals and the world around us through a particular lens. That lens is informed for each of us by myriad factors. Our own race, all of the messages we've been fed about our own race versus others, socioeconomic status, levels of education. There's so many factors that go into this. Even, interpersonal dynamics within a family, right? Depression, substance abuse, whatever it is. And I think it's really important for all of us as individuals to think about what those messages are that have informed our worldview, and therefore how we fit in the world. Now, whether or not we choose to engage in what we describe as activism is a separate matter. But being aware of our privilege or lack thereof, or just even our placement, I think is important for us because it enables us to understand the world around us better, treat others with dignity and respect, and also understand the role that each of us can play, whether it is overt or covert, in creating a better world for yourselves and everyone around you. And look, I go back to my mom a little bit for this. I'm very, very fortunate. I have an incredibly loving family. I came out when I was 14, 15 years old. Maybe it was a little bit of a journey for my parents, but really not that long. My mother is a psychiatric social worker, psychotherapist, which is not a profession that you can say a lot of 82-year-old South Asian women come from. I had a maternal uncle who in the 1960s as a PhD student here in New York, without any permission or discussion with his family in India, married a white woman and brought her back home to Bombay and was like, this is my wife. And so despite coming from...
I would have loved to be in the village
with
that.
Let me tell you.
You wanted to see that. If he loves the reaction.
Yes.
The team.
And so particularly in my mother's family, I think there was a progressivism or an open-mindedness that was just sort of in some ways forced by that act of my maternal uncle. And I have a story about how my first memory in life is that I told my mother that I used to live on top of a mountain in a temple in the sky with him, and he told me to come down and be with her. He died before I was born. It's very cosmic.
Oh, wow.
But I also grew up in a household where there was a degree of diversity in my extended family, and my mother gave me some tools to be able to identify and talk about my emotions, of which I had many. Maybe still do. But I say that to say that having that level of exposure as a very young child, but then going into the world, and I grew up in a very, very white neighborhood in New York City, Alexis, you will be familiar with the term that we used in city government for a long time, which is called quote unquote white ethnic. So a neighborhood that was very Italian and Irish and Jewish, right? So, and a lot of these communities, let's call a spade, did not take kindly to brown of any type or black of any type. And there was really no option. Like either I had to survive or I would have just been obliterated. Like I could tell that my sense of self would have been obliterated. And even though I maybe didn't understand some of these messages coming from my mother when I was 4 or 5 or 10 the way I do today, she would make it very clear that you have to develop a sense of self in order to be able to contend with the world. And though I think my understanding of that was totally unconscious, subconscious at the time, I realized that the only way I could survive was just by being. And so whether that was being effeminate, whether that was being small, whether that was being very academic, whether that was dancing a lot, whether that was singing a lot, performing, whatever it was, of which I did a lot, I just had to. And when, as I went through adolescence and, I'd always been very political, maybe partially for this reason, I realized that the only way to fight for the world that I really wanted to create was to be a part of that. And so last Saturday night, Alexis, you might remember Ana Maria Archila, who's the co-director of the Working Families Party, she gave some remarks at my birthday party. And one of the things that she said was when we started organizing together nearly 20 years ago, it was unfathomable that immigrant communities could organize alongside queer communities, or let alone that there was such an identity as a queer immigrant, or that a 21, 22-year-old queer son of immigrants would be working in a congressional office.
That shall not be, well, it could be named.
People can look it up. There's a whole documentary about it. And, this is not at all to sort of toot my own horn, but in every professional space that I have ever been in, I have been the first of X. And I don't say that to laud the fact that I was first of X. I say that because no one ever knew what to do with me. And so what I realized is you have to do your job 10 times better than anyone else would, number one. That's common. We know that. But 2, if you are anything but yourself, people won't believe you. They won't trust you because they already have a lot of reasons not to trust you. And just by showing up the way you are, they already scratch their heads. And so your only option is to be as sincere as you can be, embody your values, and embody yourself.
Love that. Yeah, I mean, I love so much about what you said, Amit. Ify and I've talked a lot about how being creative, finding artistic passions. I love you said also like singing and being your authentic self and finding what spaces you want to be in, because at the end of the day, like you can have movement, but you also have to have some joy in it, and particularly when times are tough. And so I do want to flip the tables in our next section to get in. You hit on a couple of points about like how you had to navigate to even be seen or be allowed to be in spaces. There are a lot of young people right now, and obviously we are at a moment in time where it's just the vitriol. Like I go underground for a day or two with like a new client, and I come up and I'm like, how much have I missed? This particular week has been tough on so many of the issues that we care about. If you're a young person out there, like, and we're kind of like in our mentor era here, the three of us, of like where we are in our careers. I mean, you see the loneliness rates are staggering, this kind of need for human connectivity, combine it with the constant attack on immigrants in our country right now. And like, this is why we're talking about flipping the tables, because even Jesus had to flip some tables to get real about the moment where you just see blatant hypocrisy. And so when you're talking about this authenticity, it really resonates for me that you have to go above and beyond, particularly as people of color, to be seen as authentic and real. And meanwhile, there's no tangible grasp of facts, authenticity right now in our current environment. And young people are trying to find how do they navigate. So I mean, what would you say to young queer South Asians that are feeling like how they navigate this moment? They're looking at your career and saying, how did he do it? In a time where it feels like there's even more stacked against people right now, particularly immigrant communities. Yeah, it's a heavy one. We just go right into the tables.
I mean, this is your soapbox moment. So whatever you want to get off the chest. I'm not Catholic, but if you would like to confess anything,
Well, you're just asking the big question.
Yeah.
Let's get rid of social media.
Two chill questions in there.
Well, I mean, do we need to?
AI, I mean, we could spend 10 hours just on that topic. I mean, I don't think any of your viewers or listeners, need to sort of hear me lay out the many, many challenges that we face on that front. The one thing so a couple of thoughts on this. Alexis, you brought up actually my birthday party. We'll go back to that. It just happened. It just happened.
It was really
I'm inviting myself
here 41.
Because I have already made up how glamorous this was, and I was in the back somewhere, so with a boa.
You would have enjoyed it.
Yeah.
It's right up your alley.
I think one of the greatest gifts that maybe our generation still had when we were maturing, there's that word again, was that our primary interactions, even though maybe we had cell phones and text messaging and whatever, our primary interactions were in person.
Yeah.
And so we actually learned, again, consciously, subconsciously, how to understand and perceive and connect with and contend with and negotiate with, good, bad, or otherwise, the person or the people in front of us.
So true.
Yeah.
And I perceive, and I can't say this for sure, but I perceive, and even just sort of observing in professional environments, having managed people who are younger than us, there is an anxiety, a reluctance, a confusion, a fear of engagement that at first really baffled me. And initially when I encountered it, I thought maybe it was unique to the individuals that I was interacting with. But over time, what I have come to believe, I can't state this empirically, is that the way in which we interact with each other digitally is a massive contributing factor.
Sure.
And if how you are getting your affirmation and how you are communicating what you want to say is all filtered through multiple layers. It's not just that you're using a phone, right? And you're typing something. It is the photos you are choosing to post. I mean, we all do this. The photos you are choosing to post, the way in which, what is the setting of that photo? What is the filter of that photo? Where are you physically in the world? What are you trying to convey? Who are you trying to convey it to? Do you have one audience? Do you have multiple audiences? When you're typing a text message, all of a sudden it's become, maybe not all of a sudden, but in recent years, it's a question. If you use punctuation, does that mean that you're angry? I mean, this is like people going through thousands of synapses firing in our brains all at once, maybe just to say hello.
Yeah.
And it's no surprise to me that someone might feel overwhelmed when their natural inclination is to filter all communications this way when they're faced with doing it in person, because you have, in theory, less control over all of these inputs. And so I would encourage anyone of any age to try to seek out as much time as possible with the people you love, or the people you want to get to love, or people maybe you don't even like, but you have to work with in person. I think it is really important to developing a better understanding of somebody else, a better understanding of yourself, how you interact with the world, what you could be doing differently, where your strengths lie, and really building deeper connections. And one of the things that I feel really is a gift is that everyone who is at my birthday, whether or not I get to see those folks frequently, they're all connections that I built in person.
Yeah. For those who don't know, I used to run a national youth gun violence prevention organization. And as an elder millennial, I felt a lot of grace over time for what Gen Z have been going through. And particularly, you really do think about your life and your brand being built online at such a young age. And I remember there was so much fear, if you actually did some work with us as well, of just what happens if you get canceled. If we were in high school, you find out you missed a party on Monday, you don't find it in real time that you were left out of something. And when you're in this formative moment in your life where so much of you is identifying like the type of person you want to be, that should be a time of exploration and joy and just making mistakes and figuring out what type of human you are. Instead, we kind of expect this curated, very quick hot takes type of persona by 16 years old. I don't know. I don't think I would have been the most articulate person online at 16, but then it goes deeper to like these feelings of loneliness, belonging, and think of some of my favorite memories from being in drama club or working on campaigns and knocking on doors together and organizing, or being at youth group overnights, and like those times where you could just really authentically be together, going back to the authenticity piece. And then when you have incredible forces beyond us who are also trying to pit different groups of young people against each other and create these dividing walls, it leaves not only a lot of work for the young people to navigate, but like for the adults, the caring adults. The stats are tremendous when you see how important it is to have trusted adults in a young person's life. I find it's really a moral conundrum of like our age. Like we see it, even the amount of documentaries have been done on this, we know, but it really does hurt your heart when you're trying to also help young people discover themselves who go through a lot of the things that you talked about growing up facing,
Well, and the ability to make mistakes.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
And the understanding that others will make mistakes.
That's right.
And that your whole self-worth is not and should not be a reflection of the mistakes that you've made. And neither should that be true for others in your life. I feel like we've crossed over into this time where the very essence of what it means to be human, which is that we understand our own weaknesses and also create new boundaries by making mistakes, is something that is being lost.
Yeah.
And is something that feels like it should not be a part of the human experience. I don't understand how that works. And so if I had a message to kids, to anyone, it would be that, right?
Yeah, I think I'm struggling a bit with the concept of, even like when I hear some things that feel like are new conversations, I struggle with, is it that we just have the words and the language for it versus if it's really new? I'm thinking specifically of this book, Black and White Spaces, and the concept of loneliness is not new. The concept of isolation is not new. And even the lack of permission of what it means to make mistakes, whether it's at school, on the playground, in the workplace, is not new. And I think that what I appreciate about what the digital space has allowed for is at least, if not anonymity, because I think anonymity actually comes with its own downfall, which allows for the bullying and the bottish and whatever. But I do think that there is, in a way that folks can't pay for like a social scientist or a third party to go out and survey, we're now a lot more aware of how certain communities have been experiencing life even before now.
Absolutely.
And I think that there's value in that. And I also think that there are ways that we talk about generations as if they are these like very bookended this year to this year, versus like what it looks like to have, I love, again, getting back to this concept of maturing, like what does it look like for us to actually have more intergenerational conversations around, we actually do understand what loneliness, it looks a little differently for us, but let's talk about that. And I think about the ways that we have often, how the tech community or the tech boom has often been seen as such a benefit for young people. All of us kind of grew up in the half and half of what it meant to be analog and like still getting your AOL like discs in the mail when your parents still were cutting coupons. Back in those days, you would get maybe like a good 15 minutes of AOL dial-up before like somebody in your house was like, get off the phone or whatever. And now what it means for young people that have so many different narratives, for some of them starting with a Black president and then also COVID. And then so like all these different things that they're navigating, all influenced by this larger tech space, makes me really think about what is their relationship with third spaces? What is their relationship after school, where like for most of us, it was like running home to make sure you could watch like Jerry Springer episodes so that you have something to talk about the next day. And think about that. Like you had to wait to like process to then come back, we still had hot takes, but your hot takes were in the cafeteria or they were in the gym class or
like water cooler
you
moments
passed
back
it.
in the day,
Water cooler moments and I think about the expectation to always be on, which for me, understanding not only my introvertedness, but also the ways that like are probably like not as typical in communication. The pressure of that alone, if I were to think about my teenage pre-adult years, it would have just been too much that I probably would have done the opposite. I probably would have been the one that would have sunk so much away from even the advantages of the digital space. And so I think about, there's a lot that makes me both wish for sharing of understanding that could also have like secondary and tertiary benefits when it comes to groups that, again, we're in a hyper identity space in a way that's not positive. I think we're in a space where people understandably feel like they need to protect their communities. And so it can feel like every day is about protecting your community. There's a whole different discourse around defending, ideals around democracy and what it means to be American. And that can feel like an affront to people that are experiencing hardships at this moment. But it's like, what does it look like for the conversation to be a lot more of like connecting on failure or connecting on loneliness or not, maybe at times not making things so novel, but actually being like, to your point, humans do go through this. So let's create space for us to talk about it versus y'all are weird. This is new. I don't know. I just feel like there's a part of me that feels like there's a lot more about the human experience that we do actually go through versus it being only new. And I have to put it out there, it only being new when white people experience it. I think that happens a lot, that like when it's an issue for the majority, then it's an issue, but it doesn't mean it's a new issue. It just means it's an issue that now has like positionality, power, and amplification to make it a conversation. And I think that we're in a space now where we can like kind of chip away at that a little bit.
Yeah. Sometimes it's a different vehicle for these things, to your point. Loneliness is being delivered in a different vehicle, but like white Silicon Valley heads, like I think there's always a dividing of culture. And I think one commonality between the three of us, which it's not that novel to figure out, but like we all love intergenerational units. Like I know that we both have friends of all different ages, family members of all different ages, and that's an intentional community. And I think that the dividing piece like really resonates for me with what you're saying, but also when we're so divided by age, race, and pockets of where you could interact with only people around your age, race, and socioeconomic standing. Yeah, Amit, what do you think?
The point that you make that the concept of loneliness or living in the margins, let's say, is the way we talk about it as being new is something that so many communities have experienced. That's true, right? And I think we don't actually, in the broadest sense of the discourse, I mean, there is discourse around this, talk about the long-term social and psychological, maybe even genetic impact of what it means to have been a Black person in the United States or a brown person anywhere in the world where there was colonialism. And I think you're right. I think you're right about that, that we, because this is something that is now being experienced sort of by the majority culture, there's renewed kind of attention being paid to it. I also think that the point you made about us, that some of the ways in which a lot of this has come to light actually gives us an opportunity to chip away at it. I've been thinking a lot about this recently. It's funny. I was saying to you earlier, I grew up in this neighborhood where a lot of the white people were really racist. This is in New York City. And it's not as though when Bill Clinton was elected or later when, let's specifically, Barack Obama was elected, that like white people stopped being racist. Sorry, Alexis. Not you.
No. It's fine.
But not sorry.
It's not fine. I'm aware.
And it's interesting, like, it's not as though people of color in the United States, I think, ever were deluded ourselves into thinking that what had been our reality from prior to 2008 wasn't still our reality. But the overt and disgusting and aggressive and really visceral nature of it, exemplified by Trump and MAGA, really all it is bringing what has existed since the very earliest days of this place straight into the fore, and giving it more oxygen in an overt way than we've seen since the 1960s, let's say.
And encouraging it.
And encouraging.
Like outwardly encouraging it, yeah.
And making it the policy of the state.
Right.
Making it the policy of the state. And going back to an earlier part of our conversation, I think about all immigrant communities who come to the United States in particular, thinking that there is an opening. There is an opening because structurally, after the civil rights movement, there was an opening. And that is why we see the MAGA movement, Project 2025 Trump, so focused on this structural overhaul of our entire democracy. It's not just changing policy and changing laws. It's changing the entire framework. It is rigging the system so that opening, that aperture closes.
Right.
Yeah.
And because they are doing it so overtly, we have an opportunity to talk about it more directly than we've ever had. Because maybe in the last 50 years, it was done more through the pushing and pulling of various economic levers that exacerbated inequality and further exploited, in particular, immigration in terms of labor. But now it's staring at us in the face.
And since we're really flipping the tables, if we can be honest,
Yes.
and that kind of dodging the real conversation was not necessarily just one party. Like that is the norm of what we call politics, to trivialize certain communities' lives, to almost halt the progress of the civil rights, legislation, so that incrementalism was the norm and became the norm. And therefore you voted for people that talked maybe just a little bit more progress, but not too much. Or you voted for people that did the opposite. And to your point, it's just that it's a much more oxygen for much more longer hours, and a larger group of communities are being impacted in the ways that, like you said, many communities were it was never lost on many communities, that we're still working around, not just the systems, but individuals that either think that they're doing more for me than they are, which I'm going to be very honest, many of them, we may vote the same. Yeah. But they are not necessarily, there's a lot behind that pucker. They're not necessarily on some days that much better.
No.
And may even have a longer runway of being harmful towards our communities. There are a lot of people that may be listening that don't live in New York City. So the concept of even what New York City is, I always struggle with. While I love this city, I also know that my most intimate, harshest, racist experiences that I've experienced are in this city.
Unquestionably.
And not necessarily by people that would be considered MAGA. And we're just getting to the point where we're honest about that. So I just wanted to add to what you're saying, is that this ain't even about one particular party or group of people. No. It's about what's coming to light about the reality of what the quote unquote choices have also been for those in the margins. It's been rough.
Yeah. And just to quickly put a slightly finer point on that, the 1994 crime bill, Democrat. Welfare reforms, Democrat. The
drones,
drones. The deep reticence within the Democratic Party during the Affordable Care Act fight to have a real conversation about Medicare for all.
The non-putting immigration up when we were in the majority during the time of ACA, not putting single payer into the Affordable Care Act, so we wouldn't be in the conversation that we're in right now. Just a couple things.
80 plus Democrats lost their seats because of the Affordable Care Act, which we all know is a deeply flawed, very helpful and important piece, but deeply flawed piece of legislation. Those same 80 people could have lost the seats and we could have had Medicare for all. You're absolutely right you're absolutely right. I'm just going to say that.
I know we need to pivot, but I will say one thing about your work, going back to like systems and structure. I remember in college and as a poli-sci major, people freaking out about when the country would become majority minority. And the census obviously is a huge piece of how we determine that. You led the New York City Census office during COVID with a very diverse team. I saw firsthand how you put together. And the census is one tool that I think very few people know generally determines how so much taxpayer dollars are spent, how public services are given to communities of color and really understanding where people live in the country. Tell us a little bit about that and like how the census or figuring out ways to change the system, even sometimes within the system, as possible.
Yeah.
Can you just also add why it's important?
Yeah.
Also the flaws of identification.
That's right.
Race,
That's
ethnicity.
right.
Yes.
In a nation where I'm never not going to be Black. But for those that are in spaces where they have either proximity or, if we're going to be honest, part of that promise of a lot of immigrant communities is also, whether they know it or not, around assimilation or participation in whiteness. So the census has a broader, and I think a broader discussion that it would be helpful to even hear from you. What are the ways that it needs to improve in our communal participation in it?
Right. There were a ton of fears around certain questions on the census and how that would make people vulnerable, et cetera, too. Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of your viewers, listeners are familiar with what the census is, but it really cannot be overstated how much it really is the building block to the concept of our democracy. To just, first of all, understand how many of us there are is important for some of the reasons you mentioned, but also within the context of American democracy, really for apportioning congressional power and assigning to each state the same number of electoral college seats as that state has House seats. And so the idea here is that with the fixed number of seats in the House of Representatives, they need to be distributed across the 50 states based on each, as equally as possible, based on, or fairly as possible, based on that state's population. And so when you have an undercount in any given state of how many people there are, that state is comparatively going to have less representation in Congress, which means, of course, it definitely gets less resources, but it also has less political power when it should have more. And unquestionably, throughout the history of the United States, non-white people have been underrepresented structurally every single year since our founding. When the country was first founded and until slavery was abolished, I think initially slaves were not counted at all in some states, and then the practice had become that each slave person was counted as 3/5 of a human being. Just the notion of that, right? Like the notion of that is so abhorrent and is so difficult to wrap your head around, but also underscores the value of the census in terms of our participation today. Because if we don't participate in the census, it is, unfortunately, for both the purposes of political power and the allocation of trillions of dollars of resources, it's as if we don't exist. And so here in New York, unsurprisingly, in New York City in particular, we had for a long time a real challenge of lack of participation in all non-white communities, whether they're legacy Black communities or whether they're more recent Black communities, and all other immigrant communities in the census, which meant that New York City meant that the state was undercounted, because obviously New York City is the lion's share of the state's population. And it meant that the city was not getting its fair share of resources. It also meant that the city probably did not have its fair share of legislative seats in Albany. And that's really important for New Yorkers to understand, because while we think of City Hall as the center of gravity for us, the nature of our federal system is that cities essentially are creatures of the state. And so many critical decisions about our daily lives on issues of labor, consumer protection, transportation, the environment, you name it, are made at the state level, right? States set minimum wages, states set road safety standards, states are the primary place where labor is regulated, right? And so if you are a worker that's being exploited, the first place, most likely in most cases, that you're going to turn is the state, right? And so it's really critical that the decisions about our futures that are made in Albany truly reflect our communities. And so I want to give a shout out and credit to Bill de Blasio. He had the foresight to allocate $40 million in taxpayer money, the first such effort of its kind anywhere in the country, and certainly to date by far the largest, to making sure that we had as complete as a count as possible in 2020. This was always going to be a very difficult, gargantuan, Herculean task. How do you get this world's most diverse city to participate in something that a lot of communities do not trust, handing your information over to the government? We will see what happens moving forward, but up until today, The Census Bureau is actually the one part of the federal government where information can only come in, it cannot go out. And so fundamentally, for the last several decades, the Census Bureau and census data has actually been very secure. Now, I can say that on this podcast, I know it to be true. That doesn't necessarily mean that someone's going to believe me. And so overcoming that trust gap was really our mission.
Yeah.
And how do you overcome that trust gap? It's not simply a matter of putting out a PSA on network television. It's making sure that you are talking to every single community across the city, not only in the languages that they speak, but in ways that are culturally responsive and they are credible. And for a city where more than 800 languages are spoken, where you have people from every single country in the world represented, that means investing real resources in the organizations that are based in these communities and have that deep credibility. And to do that on less than a 24-month timeline, while trying to do it through the very complicated arms of city procurement, which has a lot of laws and rules,
Don't even get me started.
is incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
And what we built was a combination philanthropic and organizing operation from inside City Hall, where we funded more than 180 organizations working in hundreds of languages to do this work. In some cases, these were organizations that had an enormous amount of organizing capacity, and what we were giving them were just additional resources to do more. And in some cases, we were holding the hands and providing deep technical training for small organizations to figure out how they could uniquely reach their communities. One example that I always like to give is we funded an organization called Yes We Can, which is an organization that works with canners who are largely low-income immigrant folks, many of whom are from East Asia, but not universally, who walk on residential blocks and small business blocks collecting cans by the dozens, by the hundreds, that they then go deposit to get change back. And that's how they make their living, is $20, $30, $40 at a time. And there is, in fact, an organization in New York City that organizes this universe of really vulnerable and exploited workers. And that's what it took. So when I'm talking about 180 groups, I'm talking about groups as large as the United Way of New York City, which is this legacy, massive nonprofit that is a network of hundreds of social service organizations and has direct access to the mayor. And I'm talking about Yes We Can. We did 26 different campaigns in 37 different languages. Wow. We built a city team of 70 people. And when COVID hit, because we had funded so many organizations that also provided social services, on a dime, we said, you know what? You have food distribution lines that are 500, 1,000, 1,500, sometimes 2,000 people long. We funded you to have additional staff. Have your staff walk up and down those lines and help people fill out the census in the languages that they speak, explaining it in ways they understand. And we had the best census we'd had in 40 years.
Incredible.
That's
work.
incredible.
Incredible work on it.
As we're closing, we don't wear it on our sleeves, but part of the reason why Alexis and I, there's so many different ways we came together. Working in city government was part of it, recognizing how faith, but I think more than just, definitely beyond religion, really drove how we made our decisions, whether we were even like conscious about it or not. You mentioned that you come from a multi-faith background, Sikh and Hindu, definitely not making any assumption that has anything to do with what you practice or not practice today. But I also believe that even on just a very like humanistic, secular level, that people should have something, that believing in something and believing that something is going to be different is really important also to the human experience, right? We can't just focus on what's happening today and also not just on like the struggle. So as we close, and we call this section, Do This in Remembrance, and that is a very Christian kind of Pentecostal, do this in remembrance of me, but we kind of just want to broaden it to like something that folks should, you know, maybe add to their grounding either practices or the thing that they shouldn't lose sight of. What I'm taking away from what you have raised is I'm really going to think a lot more about the maturation process, not just on a personal level, but what I've even seen the city go through in the last 20 years, and not discounting even the small failures that have happened. At times, you mentioned a former boss that maybe I can extend a little grace. Now that I think about some of the spaces, because the reality is I am a firm believer that it's really flawed people. Like, we are all flawed individuals that make choices, and making the choice to lead a city or making the choice to serve a city is not a small thing. Just want to get a sense as to what do you feel like you want folks not to forget as they're doing this work or just being?
Thank you for that question. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share on this front. I do come from a multi-faith background. And though the ways in which a lot of Hinduism and Sikhism are practiced today, both in India and around the world, tend to look like something very conservative or traditional or constrained or dogmatic, the central ideas, of which there are many in both faiths, there's one in each that I'm going to talk about very briefly. Within the Hindu construct, it's righteousness, and I do not mean self-righteousness and righteousness. And within the Sikh construct, it's service. I did grow up in a household where both faiths were very present. My mother's faith was more present. As we know, mothers are the arbiters of culture and religion,
Yeah, it sounds like your mama held it down.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And she's Hindu. And so I had a lot of exposure to that faith. But Hindu philosophy is vast, but if you dig into some of the basic tenets of it, the idea is that the way that you as an individual maintain the balance between the cosmos and the temporal world, and that your soul reaches freedom or maturation, it reaches enough maturation to achieve freedom, is by practicing a life of righteousness. Now, that has, of course, been, from my perspective, corrupted and manipulated to mean some very terrible things. That's just two words, Narendra Modi. That's for another podcast. But at its core, it really is about how you conduct yourself and how you treat others and how you engage with the world. And that is something that was very powerful in the way that my mom imparted her faith to me and has been a building block of my identity. And I can say something is equally true for the idea of service. Sikhism is very focused on service. Every Gurdwara, which is a Sikh place of worship, everywhere in the world provides one free meal a day to anyone who walks in, regardless of their faith. It's called langar, and it typically happens at a specific time. It can sometimes be late morning. It can be the afternoon. Sometimes it's in the evening. And anyone who is hungry, no matter what faith they practice, they can come in and be served. Beautiful. And there are several tenets in Sikhism, and one is that you must always be in service to your community. And though my mother led a life of public service and my father didn't, his ethos has always been one of service in the context of our family. He is always someone that people have relied on to get something done. And so sometimes when some people talk about me as the guy who gets shit done,
they do.
I think about my dad, and he's very quiet about it, but he's very committed to it. And I don't get a chance to often talk about how these faith traditions have informed and influenced my identity and my politics, but they had a very powerful impact.
Oh, Amit, thank you. You really captured what we're trying to build here. I think Ify and I talk so much about service and what we can each do to make people's lives better, and learning that so much. Like, one reason we're called the Carpenter's Daughter is because what can you build, what can you create, and what can you really do? How can you be the hands and feet in the world to help others? And even the way you broke down the census, to me, even being there with you for a portion of that, it really hit harder for me today in a really impactful way of like thinking about how that pivoted towards acts of service in addition to the work that was hired to do, but that the next need emerged and those public servants were ready to say, you know what, maybe it's not in our job description, but that is actually the right thing to do. And I hope that for our listeners and our future guests, that we can really take this as in our own maturation process, and what are the next chapter we want to build, and how do we want to serve, and how do we want to be the builders of a better life for all of us. So I'm really so grateful to you, my friend, for being on here today. It was just so lovely.
And you are now part of Carpenter's daughter, like Destiny's Child, one daughter. So thank you so much, Amit.
Thank
this
you.
is
Thank
an
you.
amazing start to hopefully something that continues to build. And with that concludes our episode, our first guest episode. And we really hope that you join us next time. Alexis, is there anything you want to say?
Just thanks, Effie, for being you. And Amit, thank you for being you. I'm in
Thank
a
you both.
great community and company here today. I feel full. My heart is
Absolutely full, for sure. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you for spending this time with us and for being a part of this growing community.
And as always, keep asking questions, keep taking care of yourself, and keep showing up with intention.
We'll be back next week with more conversation, more curiosity, and more light.
Until then, stay grounded, stay hopeful.
See you next time
on The Carpenter's Daughter.